Since the dawn of time, humans have loved throwing things against each other to see which would win in a battle, whether it be armies, champions, fearsome creatures, or even fighters in the modern day. You can say that this desire to know which would win in a fight is ingrained in our very being, from children declaring they think their dad could beat yours, to calculating if that really angry dog barking and leaping at the fence when you walk by would be a bit too much to handle if it escaped. If that angry guy in public turned his gaze towards you, could you take him? It's a primal, instinctual calculation, and this exaggerates into the modern era during a huge age of information where we know so much more on average, and where we can compare so many more things, such as optimized hand-to-hand combat, statistics on almost every animal or creature ever, and even fantasy to expand our horizons. While my previous video, who is the greatest warrior in all of history, focused on the champions throughout time, this one will focus on the strongest of all creatures. There will be many fun things to go over, including bears versus tigers or gorillas, hippos versus rhinos, wolves versus leopards, and most things you could dream of learning on the topic. After we talk about that and decide who was the strongest creature that walked the earth, we will go back in time a bit and decide who was the mightiest that ever lived, period, among the T-Rex, Spinosaurus, woolly mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, etc. Then we can go over things that may not have even existed just for fun. How did they describe what they thought were dragons, Bigfoots, Yetis, Leviathans, giants? Overall, this would be a very fun and informative video for everyone, and we spent a lot of time researching everything, so be sure to subscribe and support more stuff like this in the future. That being said, one final note is that this video will be talking about creatures that walk the earth rather than swam in the ocean. Maybe a kraken, megalodon, blue whale, or colossal squid that could suck a whale into the depths of the ocean faster than we can track are out there, and we can pick them up Pokemon style against some large animals where they can basically swim throughout the air while a bear tries to bite it or something. But that's not what we're here for. We're here to learn if a gorilla could punch a saber-tooth in the face, if a jaguar could fight a lion, or if an elephant could brawl a dinosaur. So let's get into just that. Let's get the obvious stuff out of the way. There are over 1 million, literally, species of animals on the planet. Due to that, I think it would be a bit more optimal to just trim the fat out of the conversation. Maybe a king cobra could stalemate a bigger animal by poisoning it before it gets ripped to shreds, or a falcon is faster than almost anything else you can conceive of. But we're not here for that. We're here to know who is the strongest group of actual combatants in 1-versus-1 confrontations. If you were to have a Roman Colosseum, which animals would be dominant? Therefore, the most simple way to dissect this is to take the 7 continents of the world and pick out all of the strongest creatures from each and pit them up against each other tournament style. While some continents are much easier than others, I'll still go over some interesting matchups that happen within that continent because a lot of it is actually pretty interesting. So let's begin. Africa is home to many of the greatest animal heavy hitters you are most familiar with. Elephants, giraffes, gorillas, rhinos, hippos, lions, hyenas, cheetahs, leopards, and so much more. Most animal versus videos you would see would probably consist of some type of creature that comes from here. Luckily for us, this one is actually very easy. The elephant is by far the absolute top of the top when it comes to this discussion. Not only is it objectively the largest terrestrial land animal on Earth, but we have just straight up observed them fight pretty much every single thing in Africa at one point or another. We've seen elephants ragdolling hippos, which fight back and forth with rhinos depending on the terrain, require entire squads of lions to take down a smaller female, let alone a full-grown male, with great casualties usually ensuing. Elephants will run up to and check giraffes off of ponds and much more. Africa is by far dominated by the elephant when it comes to 1-versus-1 power. In terms of predators, the lion is usually touted as the king of the jungle, but a king has his kingdom behind him, whereas the elephant doesn't really need anybody else. One of the reasons I structured the video the way I did was because of this single creature being so definitively above everything else, with the largest being an African elephant from Kenya named Satao, weighing up to over 24,000 pounds and standing over 13 feet tall at shoulder height, which nothing else can really deal with. Not only this, but the elephants also usually have an intellectual advantage on top of the physical stat advantage, having the knowledge to flip things over to crush them with their immense weight, ragdoll them with their trunks and tusks, and to use its stats effectively to dominate, rather than, say, a rampaging bull or feral animals that just go out swinging, hoping to catch a W. The elephant actually is pretty familiar with dominating its foes and how to do so. If anything, the only losses that these full-grown behemoths actually ever take is the failure to protect, say, one of its children, rather than a loss of its own life. Unlike most modern herbivores, elephants, despite their very alien appearance, have a very primal and effective strategy to protect themselves from carnivorous creatures. Similar to the blue whale in ancient dinosaurs, which I'll go over later, they just pull a maneuver similar to a tree and outgrow their competition, which is just a far more effective combat strategy than developing insane levels of speed or camouflage. However, raising elephants takes a long time, and it has its reproductive downsides. It would take some movie protagonist level lion to ever take down an elephant by itself, but there are some crazy lions, and although they are usually a team killer, there are many lion man-eaters whom have no quarrel hunting a human and even outsmarting them. Some even do so individually without help from a pride. There's a record from Malawi where a rogue lion took down 14 people in a single month, and another in the Ngari district of Portuguese East Africa, taking down 22 natives in just 8 weeks back in 1938. One lion in 1977 had taken down 8 people and avoided being hunted, and with this, the Tanzanian trackers that found it found that it could hunt people down with only 3 legs. So maybe you could argue one of these super solo lions could outsmart an elephant, take it down, and this applies to some tigers as well, such as a tigress referred to as the Champawat man-eater, who did her huntings in Nepal and then in Kumaon, being able to take down an insane 438 people in just 8 years, before being hunted down by Jim Corbett in 1911. Lions have a good reputation in terms of their prowess in the world, to the point that men would become legends just for taking one down in single combat, to the point it would strike fear in others, such as Richard the Lionheart. However, being realistic, the greatest elephant in the Colosseum with the greatest lion is probably going with the elephant, unless once again, we get some movie-level choreography of this lion dashing through, blitzing the elephant's defensive tactics, and climbing it like King Kong to finish it off. Not impossible, just not super likely. Giraffes are also considered to be the tallest animals on Earth, but they almost always get bullied by the elephant pretty much every single encounter, with the largest of them such as the Maasai giraffe reaching almost 20 feet in height with their horns included, and 18 or 19 feet without, weighing around 1,200 to 1,300 pounds. Giraffes usually weigh between 1,000 through 3,000 pounds, which makes it no wonder the slightly shorter, stockier elephant weighing over 10,000 pounds would boss them around. As for gorillas, since I know that they will be brought up, as they usually are, gorillas are actually hunted in their natural environment by leopards and seem to actually be very scared of them, with many stories of them getting hunted down, preyed upon, and so on. They don't have a lot of natural resistance to, say, the slashing or clawing and tactics they actually possess. So, no, gorillas are not really in the discussion too much, unfortunately, as much as we'd love to see a gorilla fight like a human being, like King Kong and box a bear or something. I go over a lot more of that in my grizzly bear versus gorilla video here, which you'd probably really enjoy after this. A way to actually look at it is that they're actually surprisingly a little bit skittish of giant predators, and they have no resistance. Like, imagine you trying to tank a slash from a giant bear or tiger. It's really not going to go well. Unfortunately for me, Asia is a lot more complicated, with Antarctica being not so much. I could just do a cop-out and maybe say an Asian elephant would be the #1. However, for this video, we'll just put one of those types of animals per continent. And that actually applies double for Asia, because Asia also consists of polar bears, with polar bears actually moving between Russia and the Americas quite often, with around 3,000 polar bears sort of just chilling on the East Siberian seas. For this, we'll place polar bears as the apex of Antarctica, and consider them mildly nomadic in other places of the world. Polar bears' only real competition in terms of combat in the Arctics usually comes from walruses, with walruses having a strange real-life tank build that can allow them to survive multiple bites from polar bears with little damage, while then grouping up on them and jabbing their tusks to make the bear go away. If that fails, the walrus actually has so much physical strength they can be seen dragging polar bears that are latched on top of them into the sea and then escaping, against the polar bear's will. While this doesn't really mean that a walrus would beat a polar bear or anything, it just goes to show how these non-carnivorous animals are quite a problem a lot of the time. That being said, the polar bear is the definitive number one here. And even in many clips or fights of polar bears struggling, they are usually a bit famished for food and not the cream of the crop all the time. The largest polar bears, in fact, sometimes are found inside of Alaska and so on, with some being over 2,200 pounds and standing at almost 12 feet tall. Polar bears are widely considered the largest bear and probably carnivore on Earth, but that doesn't mean they are necessarily the strongest, which I'll go over that too. With the polar bear out of the way, we can get into the real meat and potatoes of the Asia, while it does consist of Asian elephants and polar bears near Russia and so on, is mainly contested by two carnivores, namely the largest cat on the planet, the Siberian tiger, and the eastern Siberian brown bear, sometimes called the Russian grizzly bear. Siberian tigers are the largest cats on the planet, and interestingly, they hunt both bears and elephants. In a status survey and conservation plan book and catalog titled Wildcats, we get many stories and compilations of large cats around the world and stories you hear from natives, where we learn of the hunting habits of bears and tigers. We also learn of the cooperative nature of tigers in some instances. While they don't usually use the same tactics as a lion, it is rumored in 1956, as noted by Corbett, by a village nearby, two tigers teamed up and took down a tusker elephant, or a large Asian elephant with large tusks, with no notable damage to themselves. This might further enforce that super movie lion narrative from earlier. Usually tigers tend to attack brown bears in their winter dens and are more stealth-oriented killers. We see this with many different types of predatory cats around the planet, with their records being something like 20-12 in the Siberian tiger's favor. While we could just go over the fight science, what's the bite force, what's the mass, so forth, unfortunately we actually just have a bunch of data for actual combat between these species. Considering that tigers probably try to stealth kill most of the time, and usually go for vitals like the throat or the back of the neck, this would make the matchup probably a bit more even in a straight up fight, although that's subjective, with actual matches between the biggest tigers and these brown bears usually going the tiger's route. Polar bears would be only slightly larger on average than these Russian grizzlies, if not usually the same size on the larger end as these brown bears, and that's not really changing too much. However, the largest polar bears can be titanic standing up, probably where a bunch of Yeti lore comes from, and it would probably be a bit less one-sided in terms of stats with polar bears versus the Siberian tiger. Still though, two tigers taking down a large elephant, that's pretty crazy. There are, of course, pandas and other possible contenders for the crown here, but it is very commonly accepted that the tigers and Russian grizzlies are the apex of the land, with pandas being incredibly smaller than a brown bear or polar bear, and that's more than likely going to be dominated by a Siberian tiger. If this video was about the most poisonous or dangerous creatures on the planet, then Australia would probably have much more heavy hitters than most places. Home to some dark continent spiders, snakes, and much more, Australia is more in that poisonous category, with the actual land or combative forces you'd see in a video like this being quite scarce. Kangaroos, dingoes, crocodiles, and emus mainly. While there was the Great Emu War in Australia, with Australia unironically kind of losing said war to those birds, this was not because emus are some berserker super bird that can just tank gunfire like a Resident Evil BOW and conquer land in the area, but more because Australia was short on supplies, and Australia was found in a bit of a scarce manner, which led to many faults and things, such as the Emu War, which, for those that don't know, was basically Australia putting bounties on swarms of giant birds that kept dominating crops and eating them, with the government having a Looney Tunes level scuffle with the creatures, trying to come up with various schemes to get rid of them. Dingoes are more in line with a wild dog than, say, a wolf. And kangaroos are a strange bunch. They are sometimes intelligent, acting almost like strange people sometimes, but a man can actually kind of box one in the right circumstances and even wrestle them. Although they're pretty strong and muscular, and they will lean on their tail to jab at people with their talons or lure dogs into rivers to try and drown them. That being said, their crocodile is definitely number one in Australia, which was probably what led to the rise in popularity of things like Crocodile Hunter and so much more. While crocodiles have certain weaknesses a man like Steve Irwin can take advantage of, kangaroos and dingoes will be hard-pressed to replicate that, thus leaving the debate pretty clear-cut. Australian crocodiles are also massive, dinosaur-like creatures when they reach their max sizes, chasing down golf carts and looking like actual miniature kaizus. I don't think you even need to dig into the science of why they'd be the top of the area. As a fun fact, the crocodiles in Australia are the biggest reptiles on the planet, larger than any other crocodiles, alligators, Komodo dragon, etc. This is due to the very optimal environment Australia presents, the warmth, the river systems, abundant food sources, etc. Some large crocodiles such as Sweetheart measure over 18 feet and would grab hold of and rip the sides off of the boats of fishermen, causing them to have to swim away in fear. However, the largest crocodile we have ever recorded seems to be that of Lo Long, which was captured in the Philippines in 2011. Over 20 feet in length and over 2,300 pounds. Europe, despite being home to many countries, is actually pretty sparse in terms of powerful land animals and variety, with the most powerful land animals consisting of the European brown bear and wolves. Specifically, the European gray wolf, Italian wolf, and Iberian wolf, with brown bears being the obvious default superior to any of these wolf species in a 1 versus 1 scenario. If you want to take out bears for the video, then the gray wolf would be the number 1 in Europe more than likely. The European brown bear, to give some context, on average is smaller than, say, an American brown bear, such as a grizzly bear. However, at their maximums, they can be somewhat relative, but still a little bit smaller, although the most titanic grizzly bears usually far outclassed. On the average higher end, they can be somewhat relative. For context, the largest European brown bear is about 1,058 pounds, while the largest grizzly bear, such as Teddy, exceeded 1,300 pounds, with some estimating in his prime he was around 1,800 or 2,000, with polar bears exceeding 2,200 at their most titanic sizes. As a fun fact, both hippos and rhinos used to exist in Europe, going extinct in the Pleistocene epoch, with the rhinos actually being more adapted to colder climates like the Ice Age, unlike the African counterparts, such as the woolly rhino or the Siberian rhino. But most went extinct about 30,000 years ago, with the woolies going extinct at the end of the Ice Age. Many suggest that humans actually would have hunted them as well, and this actually applies to hippos, even living in Britain near old rivers and so on, even if they weren't actually native, but eventually losing their favorable environmental conditions. North America consists of a lot of strong animals, with a large variety of bears, wolves, wolverines, and even mooses. While the wolves and wolverines aren't really much in the discussion, while sometimes, say, a wolverine can steal kills from a bear and scavenge moose, and on rare instances try to hunt them, they are very much outmatched one-on-one in a confrontation with a grizzly bear or a moose. A moose, such as the larger ones like a bull shot by Dal DeWeese in the Yukon River in Alaska, weighed 1,800 pounds and was almost 8 feet tall. I actually suggest watching a video on moose sometimes. They are surprisingly huge, and they are actual tanks, borderline freakish, deer-like creatures. They get into confrontations with grizzly bears sometimes, although bears tend to not prefer them, as a moose can actually kind of put up a fight against them, and sometimes just due to how massive they are. That being said, though, the grizzly bear does win here, with sometimes there being rumors of grizzly bears using super strength to chop off a moose head with a swipe of its paws, or pushing rocks onto large bisons, or being these indestructible machines of death to the pioneers and their gunfire in the past. If you're interested in gorillas versus bears, by the way, and much more on a grizzly bear and what it's capable of, such as its bite force or much of the legends that surrounded it when we were discovering them, I have a full breakdown on that here you might enjoy. South America, while possessing many strong animals, is usually dominated by either the jaguar or the crocodile, with this debate being quickly ended by the fact that jaguars will actually just hunt crocodiles, not only being able to beat them on land, but even hunt them in the water, which actually surprised me as well. I was like, even in their own domain, they're getting overpowered by the jaguar. Getting behind them and exerting so much force, they can basically chomp their brain out from behind while they're alive. While these crocodiles are clearly nowhere near the same size as a kaiju-like sweetheart from Australia, it still shows they are the apex predators in South America. There are bears in South America like the Andean bear. They're mainly herbivores and quite passive, with the jaguar possessing more hostile instincts to kill them than vice versa. They're also not that large. Considering how Siberian tigers do against the much larger and more aggressive Russian grizzlies, it's easy to see why the jaguar would don the crown in South America. That being said, while it's a fun conversation to pit certain animals against certain animals, the elephant absolutely dominates the others. It's not really a debate. Said maybe a very, very scarce number of super lions or tigers that can specifically coordinate like they're in a movie to kill an elephant. However, this is in teams, and in terms of the pecking order, it'd go probably elephants at the top, followed by those massive herbivores like giraffes, hippos, and rhinos. Then more of the carnivorous and super giants like tigers, bears, and then lions, jaguars, and then crocodiles. However, there are some massive crocodiles that can sort of change things for sure, and I'm actually curious if you guys think that the jaguars that dominate the crocodiles in South America could maybe take on one of those super massive ones in Australia. With that out of the way, we can move on to the next part of the video. Before our written history existed many legendary behemoths most of you are probably familiar with. Tyrannosaurus rex or T-Rex, Spinosaurus, Brachiosaurus, Triceratops, Megalodon, so on and so forth. These creatures are undoubtedly the most powerful things to ever walk the planet or swim in it, except for a bonus section at the end of this video where we go over things a bit more plausible in the mythological category, so look forward to that. That being said, the mightiest of the mighty tend to be variations of the stereotypical dinosaur archetype, with some of these variants and species reaching a more titanic scale in comparison to the classics, but all in all they are very solid choices. The T-Rex in particular, or more particularly the Tyrannosaurs or the Abelisaur, is usually considered probably the largest set of carnivores to ever exist by quite a lot of people, but upon further inspection, this isn't exactly true. The largest T-Rex specimens we have ever found, nicknamed Scotty and Sue, tend to be considered around 42 feet and roughly almost 20,000 pounds. Others, like a Giganotosaurus, have been found around 39 through 43 feet as well, with some completed estimates, emphasis on estimate, putting them at around 45 through 47 feet tall, with various biases in place, with Carcharodontosaurus also being around 39 through 43 feet as well. Comparing these theropods is sort of like comparing maybe brown bears today. Usually they only have slight variations in scope, with there not really being, say, a polar bear equivalent to point to as the definitive alpha, just maybe slightly larger specimens of the same species than others. The Tyrannosaurus is very evidently and commonly believed to have hunted, fought with, and killed Triceratops, with Triceratops in layman's term being the equivalent of a type A super rhino, almost reaching the size of an elephant, but with a lot more of its physicality built for combat. The T-Rex in raw size is like two elephants lined up together, and would probably slaughter a full-grown male in one-on-one combat. I don't think anyone would disagree, it's kind of common sense, but for the video it should be stated, especially if it's possible two tigers really could tag team a tusker elephant in rumors, even if it is sort of an exception. Unfortunately for them, there are potentially larger predators than this. The Spinosaurus has a specimen confirmed to be 46 feet and estimated to be 46 through 59 feet long, making it pretty solidly longer and likely larger than the earlier mentions. However, its ability to fight is where things get uncertain, as well as its mass, with some debating if it was more of an amphibious type hunter rather than, say, fully built for land combat like the Tyrannosaurs and so on. However, we actually have some possible confirmations based on fossil remains that the Spinosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus would sometimes fight and kill each other for food and territory. While obviously more rare, it is possible it happened and could have happened, similar to Siberian tigers and brown bears. Likewise, sometimes the Carcharodontosaurus would kill the Spinosaurus and sometimes vice versa. However, the evidence around this, such as the vertebrae fossil with Spinosaurus bite marks on it, are theorized to be a hoax, where some people think that perhaps the Spinosaurus took one out, with other evidence such as a Spinosaurus dorsal vertebrae with a large bite out of it from a large carnivore, like our Carcharodontosaurus, is also lacking a lot of evidence, and even then it was likely a younger Spinosaurus that would have been attacked. So all evidence of them fighting is debatable, but it is definitely possible that it did. The Spinosaurus is nowadays considered, despite its long length and size, to actually be quite slender and more aquatic than a T-Rex. Some argue they are smaller or more newt-like due to the bone structures in their tails, and some argue they are more akin to a crocodile. But it can't really be denied that many diagrams of them are probably a bit exaggerated or a bit off-model, with the T-Rex clearly being a more stereotypical hulking death machine build with its massive torso and so on, whereas the Spinosaurus is more debatable, which probably causes it to also weigh a lot more than a Spinosaurus. All in all, it's a heated back and forth debate that's been going on for a very, very long time, and it may never have an answer unless we dig up some crazy fossil remains somewhere deep in South America or something like that. However, this all becomes completely irrelevant compared to sauropods, the elephant or land whale equivalent of the dinosaur era or hypermassive herbivores that were just too big to attack one-on-one, just like an elephant these days. These titanosaur sauropods are so big that it's actually just fucking stupid, like seeing Godzilla or King Kong navigate around skyscrapers and being way too big in a movie stupid. If you actually look at how big they are, it starts to become a bit bizarre that they even existed. Imagine how big a polar bear is compared to a person when it's standing up, then an elephant, and then a T-Rex. These sauropods, such as the Brachiosaurus or Patagotitan, would make them look tiny, and were so powerful, they would probably ragdoll them like an elephant does to a hippo on video. The Patagotitan is considered the largest titanosaur, with it measuring to be around 28 meters tall and considered 9 times heavier than the largest elephants, making these things almost as big as a 7 through 10 story building. Not only that, but they also are theorized to be donned with a type of armor to protect them from predators. While some people debate about which species or global or time variant of titanosaurs are the biggest, Patagotitan is probably the safest just due to current empirical non-estimated data. That being said, they are by far the most powerful creatures that walk the earth using said data. However, there is another contender, and this contender is actually potentially larger than the Patagotitan, titled the Argentinosaurus, which was around 131 feet long and about the size of a 10-story building. This one is still being a bit built up upon, but those are the two competing at this time, with no debate of, say, a colossal theropod kaiju out there or some massive T-Rex that just dominates everything like Godzilla that actually exists as an example. Usually these sauropods and these Brachiosaurus type creatures tend to be the largest and most massive and most powerful 1v1 combatants of all time, and it's not actually really debatable. Completely off topic though, apparently T-Rexes are really good at smelling things, which was kind of a weird fact to learn. It could smell more than likely miles away based on the shape of its nostrils and skull. But anyway, on to the next section. Back in ye old times, people used to classify giant lizards as dragons. If Richard the Lionheart saw a T-Rex, he'd probably call it a behemoth or a dragon, and so on and so forth. This is true in the sense that even Komodo dragons are called Komodo dragons. They thought the armored and bulkier woolly rhinoceros was a dragon even in some stories, and that being said, what we'd usually call dinosaurs today, people in the past would have referred to with more mythical terminology. Is it so impossible we don't have every single fossil of every creature that would have existed in all of time? Well, I'm not saying anything I'm going over next will be true per se. They are accounts I think are interesting, that you guys will enjoy, and are the most plausible of the legendary class of killers we see in the last few thousand years or so, that may be able to compete with even our ancient dragons we have fossils of today. You might even find yourself nodding and saying, yeah, maybe it is possible something like that happened. So let's get right into it. Interestingly, the less plausible cryptid-type predatory creatures actually tend to be the lamest in terms of, I guess, power level. For instance, most legendary creatures tend to just hunt down livestock, maybe hunt a few guys down, and then get shot a bunch and run away, often being some misidentified creature or possessing some strange powers that make it impossible to stay around them or identify them completely, and your memory is hazy, blah blah blah. We'll be avoiding the many government-reported, say, vampire stories, and take that as a story of more of a class of human or something, with many of these stories being quite messed up, such as vampires being revealed via torture or other means. Not good. Werewolves are a bit similar as well. However, there is one notable werewolf or wolven-type beast creature called the Beast of Gévaudan, which was a large creature that killed over 100 people in France, to the point that the King of France had to actually hire wolf hunters to take it down. There are stories of the Beast of Gévaudan being fended off by kids with sticks, taking barrages of musket fire, and overall being a nuisance to the area. You could theorize this thing to be anything, a weird panther-like creature, a lion, a hyena with some disorder, whatever it is. Chupacabras and the like tend to have similar stories, and not being that interesting in terms of the pecking order that we've outlined in this video. There's another such as the Jersey Devil even being reported by the Navy itself at one point, which took cannonball fire through it and kept flapping away. Albeit it seems to have taken damage from the cannonball, it didn't also seem to care. Things get a bit more consistent when we get into things like Bigfoot or giant humanoids and the like. Bigfoots, Yetis, alien forest men, whatever you want to call it, have been well cited too many times and are often debated about with varying results. You could make an entire video on whether these were real, with some stories even going so far as Teddy Roosevelt seeing something akin to one and being scared out of his mind after it killed one of his close friends on a hunting trip at night, or when a child went missing in a national park and Green Berets were sent after it in a story, with the government then telling nobody what was happening, even the child's parents. Other legends and lore say that it possesses spiritual powers, telekinesis, knockout gas, say similar to the Flatwoods monster, and would 1v1 and wrestle large brown bears and defeat them with somewhat higher difficulty. While it's definitely the most likely of the modern cryptids, no real tales from any of these creatures that have them, say, fight a T-Rex, Patagotitan, or even an elephant sometimes. Bigfoot sightings also tend to range in scope, going from Bigfoot to giant territory, such as the infamous and more recent Kandahar Giant. The Kandahar Giant was an incident that took place in Kandahar, Afghanistan around 2002. It was described very similarly to ancient giants in biblical sources, where the giant possessed 6 fingers and was ridiculously tall, with the Kandahar Giant being likely larger than even the reported Goliath, standing at 12 feet with red hair. This story was reported by anonymous special forces, and the giant was able to battle against multiple squadrons of the US military, enough to where some type of reinforcements were actually required after battle. Whether this was done in some type of Doomslayer fashion or more akin to a Predator movie is unknown, but even in its final moments, it took barrages of more modern caliber firepower from another reinforcement squad around 30 seconds straight to take it down, while it speared some poor soldier in the process. If this story is to be taken as true, while it's usually considered more of an urban myth, the Kandahar Giant may very well be able to hunt down and kill, say, the likes of an elephant, being able to take an absurd amount of damage from 50 cals or whatever modern weaponry and still fight, being much more physically capable and agile than any man could ever dream of. I guess imagine a pickle from Baki in real life scenario. But dragons is where we get into the real important meat and potatoes of this subject. What people would call a dragon is subjective and can be a variety of things. For instance, the dragon of Klagenfurt, which people mistook for a huge wingless crocodile with a type of deadly breath. They lured it in with the bull carcass on a chain, killed it, then mounted its skull on display, which is still surprisingly there today, which leads to what we can observe as actually a woolly rhinoceros skull, perhaps leading into some insight of their more aggressive and different nature than the rhinos we are familiar with today, if the story is even true. There are others, such as St. George slaying a dragon that 15,000 people could not deal with, that required 4 ox carts to haul away. 4 ox carts can haul away the likes of an elephant, a T-Rex-sized creature around 24 through 32,000 pounds, considering the nature of the dragon George killed, and may line up with other rumors in terms of size, such as the Wawel dragon. If some T-Rex type creature existed and they took it out, this is 100% how they would describe it. Now, while I can't say anything about its human-like intelligence, or if its massive body size and torso cause its breathing to come off as more fume or flame-like, it's still interesting.
Many of them report on these things flying, so even if you want to disconnect them from the likes of a Tyrannosaurid or Spinosaurus type theropod, you could visualize them as sort of a creature on that scale that can also take to the air somehow, like a pterodactyl. Now onto the most likely dragon tale, which, while still probably being exaggerated, leads us to learn some interesting information, and that is the Baghrada's dragon. In 256 BC, during the First Punic Wars, the wars between Carthage and Rome, would eventually lead us to North Africa, to the Battle of Bagradas, led by Marcus Regulus and his forces of 15,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, which would eventually lose out to swarms of elephant cavalry and the tactics of a Spartan mercenary. Due to this loss, it was likely they'd come up with some stories, the story originating in the 1st century BC. However, these stories would be considered factual by some historians, where on their march to the fatal war, they encountered a massive serpent the likes of extraordinary size, which when they finally killed it with loads of artillery fire, catapults, and their entire force jumping it, it finally fell, oozing out gases and other pollutants that caused them to retreat before skinning it and sending it back to Rome, which a later Roman source comments on and confirms, with the combined sources telling us it was a 120-foot long serpent that whipped things with its massive tail to incapacitate humans. Sound familiar? People debate about this quite often. Could have been more akin to a type of trophy system, or a trophy metric, or a story to explain that following defeat and so on. Unfortunately for us, only its skin seems to have been sent back to Rome, which would have decayed and vanished with time, whether true or false. Many theories would say that it is a titanic snake. Some historians have considered these 30 through 40 feet long snakes as types of dragons or large serpents. It's quite inconsistent depending on which historian. And as an interesting fact, however, many ancient sources from all sorts report on giant snakes that could reach over 30 through 60 feet, which we have some proof of today, such as the Titanoboa, which reaches 40 through 50 feet in length. Due to this, you could have a theoretical gigaboa, or even more massive than normal titanoboa-like serpents that they would have encountered, especially if used by a military or captured by the likes of war, with many rumors of these giant serpents just being able to devour large cattle, strike birds out of the air, whatever have you. However, these same historians may go between dragons and serpents, differentiating the two. Assuming this story is true, however, if there was a 120-foot long gigaboa, hypothetically, it may be able to take down the Patagotitan via the likes of strangulation of its neck or whatever combat headcanon you can make of that story, if it doesn't just get stomped out elephant style beforehand. Assuming this 120-foot long dragon isn't just another of our 120-foot friends we already know of. That being said, thank you to Crisis Comics for the editing and for going over a lot of these with me and helping me categorize it. He kind of came up with the tournament style structure of the beginning, and it was fun going over cryptids with him and kind of laughing about how overpowered just these Patagotitan kaijus really were. It's kind of ridiculous how just absurdly big they were compared to everything else. In fact, I don't even know how it was possible for the most part, but maybe they just ate too many plants. But that being said, it seems as though the Patagotitan is probably the largest. Maybe there's some other type of sauropod, like an Argentinosaurus or whatever have you, some type of species akin to that style of creature. A large, massive herbivore, similar to how the elephant today would be the biggest and most powerful. In terms of the cryptid, maybe there was a 120-foot serpentine dragon fit for combat that could fight armies and required 15,000 men and 500 cavalry plus to defeat, and may have had so much mass and heat that it had fumes coming out of its mouth when it breathed. Also possible, but it depends on what you believe. Either way, though, I think the visual you have on screen here will be sort of the pecking order, and I think that it's pretty clear-cut. But if you guys have any thoughts about it, maybe you believe in certain dragon stories I didn't mention, or there's some other type of cryptid creatures, or what other mega creature you believe in, I'd love to hear about it and what you think is the most powerful. I'm also curious about specific matchups you guys believe in. Do you think tigers should be above bears? Do you think a tiger would annihilate, say, a hippo or whatever in a fight? Could be a debate. But that being said, that's all there is to say. Until next time.